Luke Nathan Phillips is a great advocate of this. Luke, will you read us the Braver Angels Way, please?
I would love to. Thank you, Madam Chair. We state our views freely and fully without fear. We treat people who disagree with us with honesty, dignity, and respect. We welcome opportunities to engage those with whom we disagree. We believe that all of us have blind spots, and none of us are not worth talking to. We seek to disagree accurately, avoiding exaggeration and stereotypes. We look for common ground where it exists, and if possible, find ways to work together. We believe that in disagreements, both sides share and learn. In Braver Angels, neither side is teaching the other nor giving feedback on how to think or say things differently. And that is the Braver Angels way.
Thank you so much, Luke. All right. With that, I call this debate to order. The resolution on the floor is resolved, let Trump run. Resolved, let Trump run. Now, I am looking for a first speech in the affirmative. And in fact, I believe that Joe is ready to speak. Joe, are you ready?
Madam Chair, I'm ready. Yeah, proceed.
Please, the floor is yours.
Madam Chair, I rise in the affirmative in support of the resolution, let Trump run. Assuming that Donald Trump is the presidential nominee for the Republican Party, and at this point, after the primary in New Hampshire, that seems extremely likely, my position is that he should be ousted through the ballot box and not through the courts. And I'll explain why I feel that way in just a few minutes. First, a little relevant background so you know the perspective that I'm coming from. I'm a California attorney. I'm a political independent. I vote for the person, not the party. I voted twice for Republican candidates, McCain and Romney versus Obama, but I turned around and voted for Democratic candidates, Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden versus Trump. So I take a look at the person, not the party, and try to find someone who most closely matches my feelings, my beliefs, my positions. And that's how I conduct my political affairs. Right now, my current political hero is Liz Cheney. I think she is a tremendously courageous woman. I don't agree with her on every policy position, but she sacrificed her congressional seat in Wyoming, a very conservative state, because she had the courage to speak the truth. What truth did she speak? That Donald Trump is a threat to our democracy. It was very hard for her to do that. She comes from strong-rooted conservative backgrounds in a conservative state. It cost her Senate seat, but now she is speaking freely throughout the country to make that point, and I believe she's spot on. Now, let me tell you why I believe that Donald Trump should be defeated through the ballot box and not through the courts. Twofold rationale. Number one, there is an issue in the U.S. Constitution. It's Article 14th Amendment, Section 3, as to whether or not he violated that. That term is, it basically disqualifies anyone who engaged in an insurrection. It lists a number of offices. It does not specifically say the president as one of those offices. It makes reference to it, but didn't specifically say that. And I believe it is a close question. It's going to be a judgment call for the U.S. Supreme Court to make a decision on this issue. Reasonable minds can differ. People can argue that it definitely was an insurrection. He inspired an insurrection, not a protest, but an insurrection to take down our way of government. On the contrary, you can argue that no, he inspired a protest that got out of hand. It was not an insurrection, but really an attempt to slow down the electoral process and send it back to the states. So you can argue that either way. How the U.S. Supreme Court will decide it is an open question. There are 3 Trump appointees on the court that may or may not affect their judgment, but I don't think we should rely upon the courts to make a decision disqualifying Donald Trump. That may or may not happen. You know, it's anybody's guess. Second point is, if the U.S. Supreme Court does make a decision to disqualify Donald Trump, they might make it a broad base throughout the country, can't appear in any ballot, or it might make it on a state-by-state basis. Who really knows? What will be the impact of that decision? That's what scares me. Pardon me?
30 seconds.
Okay, impact on that decision. I'm concerned that that's going to format civil unrest. Donald Trump has shown a cavalier attitude toward the rule of law, and I'm concerned that things will get out of hand and protests will turn into civil discord and make January 6th turn minor by comparison. So bottom line, I don't think we should rely upon the courts. We should rely upon the ballot box. If we're going to keep our democracy, as Benjamin Franklin says, it's up to us. And we do it through the ballot box and not attempt to use the courts for that purpose.
Thank you very much, Joe, for your speech and for kicking us off. Now we will take some questions. Yes, jazz hands, you can thank our speaker with those. Thank you, everybody. Now we are looking for a few questions. I have seen that, let's see, Susan, your hand has been up. Do you have a question?
Yes, Madam Chair, I would like to ask the speaker if he believes that Jefferson Davis should have been allowed to run for president after the Civil War. He was president of the Confederacy and was indicted, I believe, for treason, but was never tried for that. So he was never tried or convicted for that. And I'd like to know what the speaker thinks.
Susan, thank you for your question. Joe, would you like to respond?
That's an interesting question. Of course, I'm 71, but I wasn't around at that time. But still, I think in that case, there's a good argument that he fomented an insurrection. My gosh, we had a civil war. So he would have fomented an insurrection that I think the 14th Amendment, Section 3, was enacted about that time in response to just that situation. So my short answer would be yes.
Thank you very much. David, would you like to ask a question of our speaker? David Kraft.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The speaker mentioned Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. Section 3 is preceded by Section 1 that says that no one in the United States shall be denied due process of law. It's my understanding that due process of law means that first you are charged with something, and then you are tried, and then you may be convicted, and then you are sentenced. Is it not necessary that all those things should happen before someone is punished?
Mr. Speaker, would you like to respond to the question?
Yes, excellent question. I think that's an open question. There are those who will argue that the House committee on January 16th was the due process. That was the committee that Liz Cheney was the vice chair. They did an exhaustive months and months of testimony, witnesses from both sides, and they came into the conclusion that yes, Donald Trump was responsible for fomenting that. So there's an argument that satisfies it. There's an also argument as an attorney that it should be in court based upon evidence and not through the Senate. So bottom line, open question. I think you can argue that either way.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We will move on to our first speech in the negative now. I am looking for Duncan. Are you prepared to speak?
I am, Madam Chair. Thank you so much.
Please, the floor is yours.
So my understanding of this question is, should the public be allowed to vote for or against ex-President Trump? And normally, of course, the answer would be, of course, the American people should be able to vote for the candidate of their choice. Before I go further, let me say just a little bit about myself. Like Joe, I'm an attorney, or was an attorney, no longer am. So some of these constitutional questions are ones that I'm familiar with, however, not this particular question. So I would say that normally, yes, they should be allowed to vote. However, Donald Trump is not a normal candidate. January 6th happened, and a lot of other things happened that made him so that, in my view, he's ineligible. The more important question, though, is the one that Joe raised, which is who should decide? Because there are two questions here. Who should decide and what should that decision be? So my own particular view is that on the basis of the 14th Amendment, Section 3, the answer is no, he should not be allowed to run. And I'm saying that not because I don't want him to win. I'm saying that because I want the Constitution to win. And that is a deep value of mine. So let's look at those two questions. First question is who should decide? This is a constitutional question. It is the role of the Supreme Court to decide constitutional questions. The American public doesn't vote on whether or not they're the separate but equal schools are violating the Constitution, and we don't vote on whether this ex-president ought to be allowed to be on the ballot. Whether he's disqualified or not is a matter for the court to decide. The second question is, how should they decide? What rulings should they make? And it's my view that Section 3 does apply to the ex-president. And here's my reasoning. First, it applies to an officer of the United States who takes an oath of office and violates that oath. In my view, he did indeed violate that oath because he engaged in an insurrection, meaning that he was involved in an action that either directly or by lending aid and support was designed to subvert the normal, legitimate political processes of the US government and to substitute an alternative. There is no language that the insurrection be violent, nor is there a requirement that he be convicted in a criminal court. This is a question that the Supreme Court decides on the basis of the constitutional question that it's facing. It's also important that the Supreme Court not make its decision because it's frightened of the consequence of its ruling. That is a path toward weakening our constitutional government and perhaps take us on a path toward a more authoritarian style of government. Being afraid of making the right legal decision erodes the very foundations of our government. For me, the Constitution requires that he be removed from the ballot because he's not qualified. And that's what the Supreme Court determines. And then indeed, his name should be removed. I want to repeat those two questions. Who decides? It's my view that the Supreme Court decides. And my particular view is that they should decide that he's not qualified on the basis of the 14th Amendment, Section 2.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Section 3, sorry, Section 3.
Thank you very much. Now we are looking for questions for our speaker. Mr. Luke Nathan Phillips, do you have a question for our speaker?
I do. Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I'm wondering if the speaker is viewing the invocation of that part of the 14th Amendment in the same lens as articles of impeachment, where there's a long dispute whether impeachment is to be done on strictly criminal grounds or on strictly political grounds. Political, not in the sense of like anything intriguing or anything like that, but is this a political judgment or is this a criminal judgment, and does that apply in this case, and where does he fall on that?
Right. I understand the question. I would frame it not as a political question. It's a factual question, right? And courts determine factual questions all the time. Yeah, the provision in the Constitution about impeachment is that he engages in certain acts, right? Not that he's convicted of engaging in those acts. That's a whole separate thing, right? But he engages in certain acts, and that's up to the Senate to decide. It's up to the House to submit the articles of impeachment, and it's up to the Senate to decide whether or not he engaged in those acts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I see that Sasha has a question. Sasha, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm curious if the speaker could speak a little bit about what the sort of practical consequences of having the court decide this decision instead of allowing it to go before the American people might be for us as a republic, for the sort of possibility of overcoming the current political and social strife that the question is causing.
Madam Chair, yes, thank you. That's a really important question, and it's the heart of what we're talking about. So the consequences might be if the Supreme Court decides that he should not be on the ballot, that it would be disruptive. I totally get that. However, the consequences of not deciding according to the Constitution are worse, because it would mean that we no longer rely on the Constitution to decide questions like this. We decided on the basis of how frightened we are. And that disturbs me greatly. The Constitution is the foundation of these questions for us as American people. And if we turn away from that, then we have nothing except our fears.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One more question from Dawn. Please go ahead.
My question for Mr. Holloman is hearkening back to the difference between a criminal prosecution and a political prosecution or political process. Article 1, and somebody had mentioned this before about Article 1 of 14th Amendment, which is the due process clause. I wonder whether whether he can speak to the idea that the due process clause only applies to being denied life, liberty, or property, and does not apply to qualification for a job.
I happen to agree with you, and I agree with you in two different ways, right? So I would agree that it only applies to the denial of life or liberty or property, that has to be done by due process of law. I agree with the questioner about that. And the second question it involves this question about what the issue here is. That is, he's not being denied the right to run for president. It's not that. Right? It's that the American people are being safeguarded by the Constitution to make this ruling with regard to whether he's qualified or he's not.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With that, our speaker is thanked. And now I am looking for our next speech in the affirmative. Grant, do we have Grant ready to speak?
Madam Chairman, yes, thank you. First
Please.
off, I'm the first speaker who is not an attorney, and I'm glad that I can come from a little bit different of a position here. First off, I consider myself an elder American, and I have seen many positives and negatives of American politics in my long lifetime. But I think that there's something far different about the current times that we're living. And the question that we're asking here tonight, not just about Donald Trump, but any candidate running for any office of that high federal nature that...
I don't know how to do it.
Okay, we're asking a question about candidates not being allowed to be on state ballots is such a huge question. Now, I've been hearing references to the 14th Amendment for months now and how it relates to the current dilemma. But from what I've heard, being that this is only constitutional reference being used, what makes me wonder is that many citizens really have looked further to understand the context of time which the 14th Amendment was written and why it was written and how that it connects to today. So in peeling back that layer a little bit, I'm just wondering about the original content in the 1800s, and the question really basically is, should convicted criminals, and I emphasize convicted criminals, be allowed to run for political office? And just a moment to think, this is what I think about politics. I think it's the breeding ground for greed and dishonesty and power trips and control and ego boosting and so forth. And yet it's still supposed to be about representing the will of the people, you and I. And it should be we, the people, who have the final authority to choose who will be elected or who will be rejected. And in the final results of a true and valid election process, who receives the minority of the vote receives the clear message that they were not our choice at the time. And if people are not allowed to be on the ballot, is the choice of the people heard loud and clear? I believe not. Now, there's a few ramifications that I've thought about here about not allowing any candidate on the state ballots. I see it as nothing but further fracturing our country. It's already overwhelmed with politics of the day in so many huge subject areas. It would close down the voice of the people in the state. It would disable us, the people, who should be able to send a clear message with our vote. And another trend is it gives more power to the few, the powerful few, to make the choice for us. Now, if this choice is made to refuse a person from being on a state ballot, it will absolutely set a new precedent that can't be reversed. We'll see the few powerful people repeating this over and over. People can be removed by the powerful few even without having been convicted of a crime. A new form of governance will emerge that resembles a communistic regime type of rule where people's voice is silenced. So in closing, I would just like to say that the pending harm, as I've heard already at the two previous speakers, is that it's harm to our constitutional federal republic and will suffer monumental damage if we, the people, allow philosophies to creep in and create further dividing wedge between Americans. If we allow this pendulum to swing any further, we stand a great chance of losing the freedoms we have if we allow the voice of the people to be removed from political elections. And I appreciate being able to voice my concerns.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So now I will take questions from the floor, and I see one hand raised. JP, do you have a question for our speaker?
Hi, Madam Chair. So I wanted to just address what I think is the elephant in the room here, which is there anybody, I guess, on the panel who has voted for Trump in like 20
So is your question for this particular speaker?
Well, this was based on something that was said previously of somebody who doesn't believe Trump should be removed from the ballot.
We're looking for a question just for this speaker, and then I would invite
Oh,
you
okay.
to speak.
I can come back then, or
If you
and
please
address my question.
speech. Mhm.
But okay. I mean, I guess it addresses it, but it's basically if you voted for, if somebody who voted for Trump in one of the election cycles, who who believes that he should be removed from the ballot, and the reason I pose that question, yeah.
All right. So for our speaker, are you asking him if he voted for Trump?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Mr. Speaker?
Is that the only question of whether or not I voted for Trump?
Mr. JP, would you like to clarify if you could quickly?
Yeah, I'm just curious if you voted for Trump, and just I think my broader question is whether or not this thing about whether or not we should let Trump on the ballot will be considered just a partisan axe to grind, because that's my main concern.
For
Okay.
the speaker, for Grant, what
Okay.
is your particular view on that?
Well, I heard two different things there. And if the person asking the question listened to what I said, I didn't particularly go down the Trump fan track. I was talking about the difficulties that will happen in our country if we get in a habit of, by choice of whoever, to remove anyone unless they're a convicted criminal from being able to run in each of the states. So whether or not I voted for Trump is, I don't think that that's really a part of what we're discussing here tonight.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The next question I will take from Margie Griffith.
Hi, thank you, Madam Speaker. I would like to address Grant. I agree in principle what you're saying, but my understanding, and someone may have the better view of the statistics, is the Electoral College as it currently. Okay, you want my question?
Question? Yes.
Okay. Have you considered the issue?
Has the speaker considered?
Yeah, has the speaker considered that in, I believe it's 5 out of the last 7 elections, the popular winner has not been the elected president?
Mr. Speaker.
Again, I didn't think that we were discussing the Electoral College here. I thought that we were talking about someone being removed from state ballots.
You were,
Again, the Electoral College is constitutional as well, but the only reference that we're talking about here that has been brought out is the 14th Amendment about removing someone from state ballots.
my question to you, excuse me, Madam Speaker. My question for the speaker is, when you talk about the people being deprived of their say, given that the people have been deprived, the majority of the people have been deprived of their vote, resulting in the election of a president for 5 of the last 7 elections, not related to a state, I
So,
recognize.
can you bring it to a question?
Have you considered that?
Has the speaker considered that?
Speaker considered that. Sorry, this is the first time I've spoken in a debate.
Thank you very much for the question. And we will be paying for that. So yeah, Mr. Speaker.
Well, so, Madam Chairman, if we were to get off into another side subject here and talk about the Electoral College, then I would love to talk about that, especially being that we have different populations around the country, that if we did not have the Electoral College, that would set up a whole new precedent there as far as elections and so forth. But I'm sorry, I don't want to be rude, but I think that is another subject.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will take one more question. Ronald, please, do you have a question for the speaker?
Yes, my question is, in the judicial system, we have a thing known as a summary judgment. Isn't what's happening, in fact, a summary judgment, ascertaining his guilt before the due process is at hand? And also, is a subversion a part, if he knows, if the speaker knows, of the 14th Amendment clause? Subversion as well as insurrection.
Mr. Speaker.
Being that I am not an attorney, I don't think that I would be able to speak very distinctly on that. I have my feelings, but I will answer by saying that I think that another argument here is what the court is made up of. Even the argument of what the Supreme Court has been made up, whether or not they are conservative or they're liberal, and so both parties would like to pack the courts, and so I think that that's probably a slippery attempt for me to try to answer that question very well. But thank you for the question.
With that, our speaker is thanked. Philip, I see that you didn't get to answer your question, but I will look out for you next time if you have another one. So we will move on to our next speech in the negative. Holly Sample, are you prepared to give a speech?
Madam Chair, I am prepared to give a speech. Thank you.
The floor is yours.
I'm a resident of Colorado, and I believe the Colorado Supreme Court is correct in ruling that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment disqualifies Donald Trump from holding any civil or military office of the United States. In the description of our debate tonight, there were a couple of statements that I'd like to address. First, I just want to say that Donald Trump's role in the January 6th attack on the Capitol went far beyond stirring up protests. There's a great deal of evidence that Mr. Trump planned, incited, and directed the attack in his attempt to stop the peaceful transfer of power to the duly elected president. And we know he provoked passions for months by claiming the election was rigged and then stolen. And he summoned the crowd. He knew they were armed, and he told them they had to fight like hell or they wouldn't have a country anymore. And many of us saw the insurrection on TV. We heard the crowd chant, "Hang Mike Pence," and we saw the president tweet that Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do the right thing, which inflamed them further. And we watched and waited for hours while elected representatives, media personalities, and even his own family members begged the president to stop the rioters, but he refused. So I think there's no question that Donald Trump engaged in insurrection, but does he need to be convicted of a crime to be disqualified from the ballot? And I think the answer is no. The Constitution says nothing of crime or conviction, simply that the person engaged in insurrection or rebellion. And to those who say this is a political attack, I counter that the Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is absolutely political, and it's even anti-democratic at that. This amendment was first enacted after the Civil War to block the former insurrectionist Confederate officers from being elected to state or national office, and it's explicitly intended to prevent them from abusing the power of their popularity with the majority in southern states. So finally, I want to look at another question, which is, shouldn't it be up to the American people and the Republican voters to decide if Donald Trump is the Republican nominee or ultimately elected president again? And according to our Constitution, there's only one way to remove the disqualification of an insurrectionist, and that's with a 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress. So let's not forget also that it's the continued unwillingness of Donald Trump to accept the vote of the American people that's put us in this predicament. Joe Biden won the Electoral College with 306 to 232 votes and the popular vote by over 7 million. The Colorado Republican Party filed its own appeal with the U.S. Supreme Court right after SCOTUS had accepted an appeal of the Colorado Supreme Court's decision. And their argument was that the Republican voters in Colorado should decide who their candidate is, but then they defied tradition in their own bylaws by promptly endorsing Donald Trump before a single primary vote has been cast. So how is that consistent with the argument to let the voters decide? I feel like the Constitution is clear unless or until a 2/3 majority of Congress votes to allow him to run, Donald Trump must be disqualified from holding public office in the United States of America because he engaged in insurrection.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And that was almost perfectly timed to 4 minutes. Well done. So thank you very much for that speech. And now I see, Philip, your hand is still raised. Would you like to ask our speaker a question?
Madam Chair, I would like to pose a question to our speaker that maybe has some legal implications. And it's regarded to the Supreme Court. My question is that the Constitution doesn't deal with many issues. So therefore, I'll give you an example. In the question on abortion, they just decided whether it's a national or states issue. They did not take into consideration the implications of those decisions on women and so forth. So, so my question also is, so in this case, based on knowledge of what's going on, that if the current president is on, the former president is on the ballot and he wins, the implication is that we're throwing away the Constitution. So, so my question to the speaker, do you think that the Supreme Court needs to take into consideration the impact of their decisions on American citizens?
Well, and I'm not an attorney, but I agree with the previous speaker that we need to follow the Constitution regardless of the impact. And yet, from my opinion, I think there's 3 possible scenarios in terms of implications. One scenario is that Donald Trump is disqualified and he's not on the ballot, and someone else is going to represent the Republican Party in the presidential election. And what would be the implications of that? Well, We know that there are a lot of people that be pretty fired up. And we hear people talk about civil war. I hear that talk. I live in a county where people say that at the gas station. But let's look at two other scenarios. The other scenario, another possible scenario, is that Donald Trump loses. And I can't imagine that he would accept that loss. Obviously, he didn't accept it the first time, and he's had a lot more time to prepare, and he's already laying the groundwork to convince his followers that that if he's not elected, it's rigged. Of course, if he wins, then it wasn't rigged. So then that gets to the third scenario, and I know we need to move on. But the third scenario is that he wins, and we have an insurrectionist as a president who on day one has already thrown away the Constitution and said he would anyway, and will continue to dismantle our democratic republic.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I will take one more question. Kathy, the floor is yours.
Yes, I unfortunately could not find a transcript of the trial that was held in your state, in the speaker's state, and I was wondering, did they actually prove insurrection? Was it a jury trial? Was Trump represented? I'd like to know more about the trial. Was due process provided to him? That's my question, Madam Speaker.
Thank you for that succinct question, Madam Speaker. Yes, Madam Speaker.
And I will say that I believe he was provided with due process, but not at the level of a criminal trial, because the question was disqualification from the ballot, not whether or not he had committed a crime. But he was represented, and he did have the opportunity to address the accusation. So,
did he have an opportunity?
But for someone who says it has to be at the level of a criminal trial, the answer is no, it wasn't.
Okay, thank you. Madam Speaker, I have another follow-up question, if I may.
A short follow-up question.
Was it a jury trial?
No.
Did he have an opportunity for a jury trial? I guess that would be a better question to ask.
No, it was an administrative trial.
It was an administrative hearing.
Okay. With
trial, it was the Supreme Court. I don't know. An attorney who's here could tell you more about what that would be called.
Thank you, Madam
Duncan.
Speaker, and thank you to our questioners. With that, we will move on to our next speaker. Is Robert Bodie ready to speak? Robert, I believe you are a member of one of our sponsoring organizations. Is that correct?
That is correct.
The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So what I'd like to do is get into the qualifications or the legal requirements for this 14th Amendment. So let me read it. Nobody's actually quoted what it actually says. The pertinent part of the 14th Amendment is that no person shall hold any office under the United States who, having previously taken an oath as an officer of the United States to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. And there's basically three requirements in here to block a candidate. One is that the candidate must be an officer of the U.S. The second is that the candidate took an oath to support the Constitution. And the third is that the candidate engaged in insurrection, rebellion, or gave aid and comfort to U.S. enemies. The problem here is that nobody has ever litigated the issues of whether the president is actually an officer of the United States. The Constitution does not indicate that the president is an officer, and the Supreme Court has never so held. And then that a candidate, insurrection, that, has Trump engaged in insurrection. Now, the traditional definition of an insurrection in the United States is an armed rebellion or some kind of a violent attack. And I have seen no evidence that Trump actually committed any violence toward overthrowing the government. So let's look at the president not being defined as an officer is an issue. The president you look at the 14th Amendment, and it does define specifically senators and other elected officials, but it does not mention the president or the vice president. Trump has not been convicted of inciting any insurrection or rebellion. And the interesting thing is that Trump has been indicted for a number of different crimes, pretty much any crime they could, find any evidence for. And you'd have to ask, well, if Trump has not been indicted for any insurrection or rebellion, why is that the case? And the legal analysis is that he has not committed the proper elements to be charged with that crime. So if a court, if prosecutors across the United States have not found any means to basically indict Trump for that, I hardly see how an attorney general or a Supreme Court should be making such a determination without any trial. One thing that very important is that the United States, by tradition, requires that individuals are allowed due process of law. And due process of law is highlighted in the Constitution in at least 3 amendments. The 5th Amendment gives the right of an accused to be indicted for a crime. And I've heard arguments that, well, this isn't, there isn't an indictment or a crime required, but the actual clause of the Constitution about this, that issue is silent as to what is required. So it could well be that a requirement of a conviction is necessary. The 6th Amendment gives a defendant the right to trial by jury and the right to cross-examine witnesses against him. And that's a very important part of due process. If you're accused by somebody of a crime or committing some kind of a wrongdoing, the Constitution explicitly gives you the right to confront your witnesses. Trump was not given that right in either of these determinations that took him off the ballot. The 14th Amendment also says that a person should not be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. I heard a comment by one of the speakers today that is not relevant. Well, certainly one of the liberties we have as citizens of the United States is to run for public office. So I would argue that depriving Trump of the ability to run for president is certainly removal of liberty. And I would also argue that—
Speaker, can you wrap it up within about 20 seconds?
Yeah, so the issue that we're at is, have the legal requirements been met in order to take Trump off of the ballot? And neither the AG of Maine nor the Supreme Court of Colorado have followed any kind of a due process procedure that has allowed Trump to address the accusations against him. My viewpoint is, therefore, there is no legal reason to take him off the ballot, and we should vote, let the voters decide. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. All right, we will take a couple of questions. Let us go first to Robin, and then Joe, you will be up next. But Robin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, ma'am. I would like to read a quick quote from the Constitution to the speaker and then ask a quick question. They'll be really quick.
Okay.
Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1. The executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. He shall hold his office during the term of 4 years, etc. There are also many other places within the Constitution where the presidency is referred to as an office. And my question is, would the speaker still argue that president of the United States is not an office?
What I would argue is that no legal determination that the president is an officer has ever been made. I'd also distinguish an office from an officer. And one of the reasons why I do that is one could argue, there are offices of Senate and House and that, but they are specifically outlined in the Constitution, separate from officer of the United States. Generally, the Constitution treats an officer of the United States as someone that was appointed by the president and confirmed by the Congress.
Thank you very much. We will go now to Joe Pratt. Your question for the speaker.
Madam Chair, I'd like to ask the speaker, in light of the lack of trials of all the members of the Confederacy during the Civil War, if he believes that, if he believes that that Amendment 14, Section 3 requires a criminal offense, and if so, why?
I would argue it doesn't necessarily require a criminal offense. For example, had Trump been properly impeached, and I feel that the impeachment process, the second one, was faulty because it did not give Trump an opportunity to speak. Regardless, the Senate did not convict him. But had the Senate convicted an officer, that would have been sufficient to prohibit them. And so I think that's another issue. I do think whatever the procedure, and Congress could pass laws to implement this, this clause of the Constitution, should it desire to do so, and define maybe a special procedure, but it would still have to follow due process of law and especially allow the defendant to defend themselves.
Okay. And with that, we're only going to do 2 questions going forward just to get people speaking more. So with that, our speaker is thanked. I do see all of you with your hands up, and I'll try to get as many different questioners as I can. But for now, we are going to go to our next speaker in the negative, Ronald Mack, who I believe is also a member of one of our sponsoring organizations. Ronald, are you out there? Oh, there you are, Ronald.
Yeah. Oh, surprise.
Okay. The floor is yours.
Well, there's a couple of things. I think that, I surmise that the main argument in the affirmative would be let the people decide, but we don't let the people decide everything. We have the court system for that. We have law enforcement for that. We have the legislature for that. We have the executive branch for that. It's well established that the people don't decide everything. Granted, this is an election, but there's a lot of talk about due process and the trial, but we're not talking about a trial. We're talking about qualifications. And the qualifications are mostly specific. You have to be a certain age, you have to be born in this country, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is an interpretive qualification. And we don't allow the electorate to decide any of the other qualifications. I don't see any reason we should allow them to decide this one. The court system, granted, there's always a lot of talk about Democrat and Republican or conservative and liberal in the judicial. Well, that's a problem. That's not what it's supposed to be. And I think that we need to rely on the courts and challenge them to do their job. And we've seen many examples of this all the way to SCOTUS, that they will do that. I mean, that's a characterization of the politicians. I don't think the judges necessarily believe that at all. I mean, to some extent, but I think we should challenge them to say, no, you're supposed to be impartial. You're supposed to interpret the law without bias. And I think we have to challenge them to do that. So in this case, I think they are doing that. They're stepping in and saying, we don't believe that he's qualified, and it's our jurisdiction to decide that. And I would bring in again the point that it's not only insurrection that's at hand, but clear election interference that it's at hand. And I don't know if that's part of the amendment or not, but it certainly seems, like it's pretty close. And I don't know, the former speaker spoke of, him participating in violence. Well, incitement to insurrection is still part of it, conspiracy. So I think that's all I have to say. I wasn't expecting this exactly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Okay, let's see. David Kraft, a question for the speaker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There is an issue that is unclear to me, and I was hoping that the speaker could tell me his opinion. It's my understanding that people often write in votes during a federal presidential election, usually for candidates that have no hope whatsoever of winning the election. In a hypothetical situation where Mr. Trump was not on any ballot and he was written in by a vast majority of the voters, in that situation, would he become president?
I don't I'm not going to say I'm qualified to answer that question. I can tell you what my guess is. I would say that you could write in Mickey Mouse, but Mickey Mouse still wouldn't be qualified to run for office. I think they would still have to meet the qualifications. It couldn't be just anyone, would be what I'd think about it. I mean, if you're not a write-in, you have to be vetted beforehand. If you were write-in and got the votes, I'm assuming you would have to be vetted afterwards. And if you didn't meet the qualifications, that you couldn't take office. That's my guess.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One more question. We will go to Patricia Renault.
Thank you for taking my question. I don't think we have, oh, Madam Chairman, I apologize. I wanted to ask the speaker, we have not talked about the oath of office of the President of the United States, which says, I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. In this instance, do you believe that—
Does the speaker believe?
Does the speaker believe that the former president has preserved, protected, and defended the Constitution of the United States?
Not in the least. He's openly said that he thinks we should consider throwing the Constitution out and not obeying it. He specifically said that. So no, not in the least.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker, very much, and thank you to our questioners. We will now go on to Kathy King. Kathy, would you like to give a speech?
Many of my positions have already been discussed, but I think in order to have the courts involved, as was just recently suggested, there has to be a trial first. And I believe, as some other people have mentioned, that due process requires that there be a finding and that the person who is on trial, so to speak, needs to have an opportunity to have a jury of his or her peers make that decision as a group. There's no process set out in the Constitution. Our legislators have failed to delineate what that process should be. It's their job. They failed to do it, and we should encourage our legislators to set that process out.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, for sharing that brief thought, and very much encourage for people to just continue to share whatever you have to say. So with that, we will move to questions for our speaker. Let's go to JP. JP has taken his hand down. Okay. How about Philip? Philip, would you do you have a question for our speaker?
Philip doesn't appear to be with us.
Sorry.
Philip?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Sorry, I was on mute. So I just have a question.
Please.
The speaker has said that the speaker has said that the legislature has failed to delineate a process for this, but the Congress has actually passed a statute regarding insurrection, the penalty of which is that if you're convicted of it, you're no longer eligible to hold office in the United States. So hasn't Congress already, in fact, acted by saying this is the process, by disqualifying somebody for office on the grounds of insurrection, that you have to have a criminal trial because they have passed a statute in the criminal code?
I was unaware of that. I believe that they had not yet passed that.
And the other question I have too is that, was the speaker also aware that, I know we've talked about the 14th Amendment a lot, but Section 5 of the 14th Amendment says that Congress shall have the power to enforce this Section 12, the 14th Amendment by appropriate legislation. And doesn't that mean that only Congress has the authority? And if they've chosen to do it through a criminal statute, that's really the only process we can constitutionally use if we want to disqualify somebody?
That is
office and
exactly
grounds of
who I'm
director?
suggesting should be setting out the process in detail.
Thank you.
And with that, our speaker is thanked. Moving now to a speaker in the negative, Molly Zeff. Molly, would you like to give a speech? Do we have Molly out there?
Madam Chair, I was just chatting with Molly. It appears she is in a slight logistical conundrum. She wants to speak, but would prefer to speak later on in the debate.
Okay, in that case, we will go to Paul Norris.
Yeah, so I have very mixed feelings about this. I voted for Trump twice, and I would do so again if it was versus Joe Biden or, God help us, Gavin Newsom. Interestingly, I am actually the person who suggested this resolution in the debate committee. I've actually changed my mind about this recently based on things I've read, and we actually discussed this in the Red Caucus a few weeks ago. A lot of things that have been said about Trump I don't particularly believe, but ordering Pence to not certify the vote is actually troubling to me, and that one seems clear and not necessarily, that doesn't require interpretation. But I hope that the Supreme Court disqualifies Trump. If any other body did that, it's just going to be seen as politically motivated. So I think it has to be the Supreme Court. And, I'm not a lawyer, but yeah, it's really important that it come from someplace where it's not just seen as politically motivated. And I think if it comes from the Supreme Court, I think Trump supporters, for the most part, will accept it. And quite frankly, I want to see Nikki Haley as a candidate because I believe she can win and Trump can't. And, Trump promised those of us who voted for him that we were going to get tired of winning. Well, I'm not tired of winning yet. So I go Nikki.
All right, Paul, thank you very much for your speech, Mr. Speaker. So with that, questions for our speaker. Let's go to Don. A question for our speaker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to say hi, Paul, and then I'll call you the speaker. Would the speaker consider that the state Supreme Courts across the country are also empowered to enforce the U.S. Constitution? What are the ramifications if in the future different states decided the qualifications of presidential candidates, in which we would have a patchwork of elections? What is your thought on whether
the speaker's thought?
What is the speaker's thought on whether the Supreme Court ought to be stepping in there and making the final determination?
Yeah, well, to me, it seemed, very clear. Again, I'm not an attorney, but just for realistic reasons, I think for that to be accepted, it's got to come from the Supreme Court. And I think the Supreme Court is very likely to decide that Trump is not qualified. I think he picked some great justices, quite frankly.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We will take one more question from Margaret O'Leary.
just unmuting myself. Thank you, Madam Chair. Very grateful to be here and to ask this question. Would the speaker talk me through what he would think about the following? Let's say the issue goes up to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court says Trump's disqualified. Trump says to very publicly, you know, I'm not accepting this. Can you walk me through the impact that you think that would have upon some of his followers? I'm sorry, no use. Could the speaker walk me through that impact? Thank you very much.
Well, I'm not a prophet nor a prognosticator of any great worth. But I do believe that if it came from the Supreme Court, I believe that the majority of those who have supported Trump in the past would accept that decision, and that those who did not would not be enough of a force to be overly worried about.
Thank you to our speaker and to our questioners. Now we are at about the midpoint of our debate. And so we are going to take just a 1-minute stretch. Take a deep breath. If you need to go to the bathroom, now is a good time to do it. We will just take a very short break in which I would like to introduce to you our next debate, which will be 2 weeks from tonight, Thursday, February 8th. Our resolution will be resolved, close the border. And you will be able to sign up for that at our Eventbrite. I hope you will join us. That is certainly a timely resolution. So we hope to see you back here in 2 weeks. I also want to point out that I think probably many of you find this topic with all its legal implications a little bit daunting, because I don't have a huge number of you lined up to give speeches. So I just want to encourage everybody to think this through. Don't feel like you need to have expertise. We want to know what you think. Anyone who is an American, anyone who is not, and just wants to comment on our politics, you are welcome to speak. We want to hear your opinions. So do chat to our whips. We'll get you on the list to speak. That is otherwise, we have some of our Braver Angels volunteers who are ready to speak. So you will be hearing from them. That's been a short break. So with that, I am going to call next to the floor, Mr. Luke Nathan Phillips, speaking in the affirmative.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to reiterate that, like many of our speakers here, I too am not an attorney. And I, in fact, have nothing resembling a legal or constitutional argument to make. I'm sure every argument on legalism and constitutionality made here tonight, including those on opposite sides of the same questions, has been entirely correct, and I am incapable of refuting it, any of them. But I would like to make what is very baldly and blatantly a political and ideological argument for why Donald Trump ought to be maybe not allowed to run is maybe a too strong of a term for it. I just want Donald Trump to be on the ballot in 2024. And I guess at some basic level, the sheer fact of the matter is that a lot of our fellow citizens, including a lot of my family, and sometimes even a part of me, very, very clearly wants Donald Trump to be on the ballot and wants to have the opportunity to vote for Donald Trump in November 2024. And I mean, there's a lot of different understandings of popular sovereignty and democratic theory. Some of those have more of an emphasis on the filtration of opinion and passion and interest higher up through the governing system. Others of that have a far more plebiscitary popular democracy understanding of the will of the people. But regardless of what they are, there clearly is enough of the modern conservative movement and the modern American electorate that simply wants this choice, right? And that has nothing to do with the quality of this choice. That has nothing to do with whether that's a prudentially good decision or anything. It merely is that this is something that is in the atmosphere. I don't think that that necessarily makes it automatically right. We all know that democracy does stupid things sometimes too, but we live in a system that requires the vocalization of interests always to be done, and this is how things have been for a while. The thing that the party system does is it takes these and puts them into something that opens up for choices that are palatable for as wide ranges of Americans as possible. Now, the party system hasn't been doing that very well in the last couple of decades, and that's part of why we're in the situations that we are in, but it still is how democracy works. Now, the other thing I'll say really briefly, Madam Chair, is that I do think Donald Trump has fundamentally been healthy for the American ideological and policy discourse. 7 years ago, 8 years ago, nobody in my party, and I am a Republican, was saying anything serious at all regarding the role of industrial production and national security issues, the role of the way our current global trade arrangements, which we are currently in the process of getting beyond, have been harmful to not only American life but also to American strategic industries. I mean, heck, there's even been more genuine conservative approaches towards conservationism and environmentalism. My God, in the age of Donald Trump, thanks to many of the weird ways that Trump, being not a normal conservative, shook up discourse on the right. And regardless of whether Trump himself, regardless of whether the Trump movement itself did anything in particular to endorse any of those, the chaos and the instability with which the Trump phenomenon, based in Trump the candidate, Trump the president, and Trump the man, opened up new possibilities on the American political spectrum that we have needed to get back to for decades, has made my party a far more capable of reconstructing itself into, sorry, Madam Chair, has made my party far more capable of reconstructing itself into something useful with a non-plutocratic governing apparatus for the 2020s and 2030s. I hope we get there. I don't know if Donald Trump is going to be the candidate or the president to lead us there, but I do think Trump being a force in American life and on the ballot and in politics gets us closer to that. And for that reason alone, I support his being placed in front of the American people.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. All right, we will take a few questions. First up, Laura, your question for the Speaker.
Treating him as that.
All right.
Laura, can you unmute?
I'm coming. How to find my mute button and all those things. Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Chairwoman, for the opportunity. I just want to commend the Speaker on his ability to make lemonade. I come from a different point of view. However, I do believe that Mr. Trump should remain on the ballot for the reasons that have been spoken. I also do, however, feel that his candidacy basically has revealed how difficult it is to vet candidates in our era of Citizens United when money is power and speech. I do wonder if that is the future of the Republican Party. I grew up with Nixon, who was pro EPA, protected the environment, water, air. I think I kind of admire the way you've gone around Donald Trump being
Laura,
a pro person in a novel. Anyway,
yeah.
I appreciate your point of view. I'm glad that as a younger person you're in the mix, and I definitely appreciate what you've been saying. But I agree, he should be on the ballot and get beat again in 2024. Thank you.
Madam Chair, the Speaker's question opens up a very important point about institutionalism. And I guess at some level, so a lot of my young conservative friends in DC are all about like the dignity of Congress and why we need to have responsible parties again. I used to subscribe fully to that view, and I think there's a part of like Midwest Boy Scout me that really does believe responsible institutionalism in the Eisenhower and Ford style is something that we should go back to if we can. That being said, we're not going to. We're not going to, because it is not in the institutional self-interest of any power that be it in media, parties, government, business, finance, even nonprofits. There is no interest whatsoever for anybody to be institutionally responsible and like just succumb to the party wishes the way it used to be the norm in under current circumstances. And to get there, you need to get to new alignments, new arrangements, which are simply the circumstances are too chaotic right now to get to those. So I'm all for institutional loyalty. I happen to think that the Liz Cheneys of the world they're admirable in the very key respect that they're standing up for an institutional loyalty that the world has forgotten. But the fact that the world has forgotten it is a demonstration that they have no real ability to actually build anything new. And that's the thing that we're facing these days in American politics. I don't know how to reconstruct it. That's one of the reasons I am glad to not actually work in politics. But I think at some level, the chaos is in some ways the only way through.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to another question. Ziemowit, am I saying your name right?
That's close enough. Madam Chair, I have a question for the Speaker as to why he's completely disregarding the rule of law. We spent a good portion of our debate trying to figure out how to adjudicate whether or not Donald Trump violated the 14th Amendment and who is to make that decision. And so consequently, I personally cannot say whether or not she should be on the ballot. I'm not a participant to the litigation. However, the Speaker frightens me because it would appear that the ends justify the means. He likes Mr. Trump. He likes his foreign policy or trade policy or national security policy. And so therefore, Trump should be on the ballot. And I find that reasoning abhorrent. It's illogical, actually, from a legal standpoint. I'd like the Speaker to respond to this.
I appreciate this a lot, and I apologize for scaring you, sir. So I think the reason I am no longer moved by straightforwardly legal arguments these days is because I don't believe that we have a political and legal system that maintains sufficient trust among all sections of the public for any legal decision of these sorts to be not seen as a political decision. People have been talking about whether the Supreme Court and the state Supreme Courts are things which ought to be deferred to in these. And I think that in not only in an ideal world, but in many ways in this world, they are. But I also think that as we have seen with every major Supreme Court case that has happened in the last 7 years and probably for quite some time before that, I don't believe the Supreme Court seems to have that much actual public legitimacy in terms of being an apolitical institution the way perhaps it once did. And so I do not mean to disparage the rule of law and the legal process. Those are, after all, our heritage, and those are, after all, the only things that keep anything from being a pure power game where anybody who happens to hold a little bit of power can determine the nature of reality themselves. That being said, I don't really believe that the rule of law governs all the way that the idea of respect for rule of law does. At some point, we have to make political decisions, and that I think is the thing that maybe terrifies me a little bit. But I also
terrifies me a lot.
Right, I see we have quite a lot of hands raised, so I will take, let us go to who has not spoken yet. Wow, it's moving around a lot. Judith.
Great. I'd like you to help me understand.
The speaker to help you.
I'm sorry?
You would like the speaker.
Yes, of course. Yeah, sorry. I'd like the speaker to help me understand if the Supreme Court's job is primarily to uphold the Constitution and is the ultimate arbiter of our most complicated issues, then how is it that Trump's simple statement that he would throw out the Constitution in itself not disqualify him?
I do not think that there's any reason to endorse the former president's statement there. And again, I don't really particularly think that I've mentioned I have more complicated views on Trump person. This was not an endorsement of Donald Trump for president of the United States, you might note. I just like him being in public life because there's a way that the discourse has shifted with him there. So I don't have a really particularly good answer for this question. But I think the fact that we live in tumultuous political times where this kind of thing has been becoming the norm for quite some time, perhaps merely has inured me from being too deeply worried about when things like that, or this thing the governor of Texas did the other day, or whatever the vibes contests different governors and different presidential candidates are doing. It doesn't really bother me anymore at the level of the norms because the norms are broken. The norms are broken. It's going to take a lot to reconstruct them. And I don't know why I need to be continually angered and disgusted when candidates do things that candidates do when it just keeps happening over and over again. Maybe I can behave myself differently. Maybe we can hold ourselves and hold each other to behaving differently. But this is the political environment that people in power are in these days. And I don't know that me being disgusted at it has any particular reason to affect it.
And with that, our speaker is thanked for his alternate take, then going down a different aisle. I see all your hands raised. If you want to continue this line of thought, I encourage you to get on board on the list to make a speech. Right now, we are going to go to our next speech in the negative, which will be Sasha. Sasha, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My speech will also be taking us away from the legal. I want to set aside, as the former speaker, and as many of our participants here, I'm also not an attorney. So I'm going to set aside the legal arguments, not because I don't think they're important. I think they are. I agree with prior speakers who want to emphasize the importance of maintaining our commitment to the Constitution. But I'd just like us to take for a moment a different set of considerations and think about those sort of in line with the former speaker's argument. The former speaker said that our norms are broken, so we have to stop worrying about trying to have candidates who keep to norms which no longer exist. But I would say the first rule when you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. Who broke those norms? I mean, Donald Trump might not have been the first person to do it, but he took a sledgehammer to a lot of things that I at least think are still very important to this country and that I'm not quite willing as our former speaker is to leave buried. So I think I would just like us to consider, what would another Trump candidacy potentially do to our political discourse and our political culture? What would another Trump election, whether he wins or loses, do to our political culture? And what might another Trump presidency do? I'll keep this relatively short, because mostly I just want to sort of put these questions out there for us to consider as a group. And I just would like to say, I think really regardless of what you think of Donald Trump, it seems clear that he's a uniquely inflammatory figure in our public discourse and in American political life. In the wake of the 2020 election, we find ourselves incredibly divided, with a majority of Republicans questioning the legitimacy of our electoral system, and a sizable portion of Democratic voters thinking that the former president was engaged actively in trying to overthrow the government. I mean, that's an extreme difference in how we sort of view the reality of the world from, between fellow citizens. And it just seems like something we should consider is what the effect of another, what month is it? 7 months, 8 months of Donald Trump being front and center of our political life, sort of repeating his claims about the stolen election, repeating the sort of vitriol that he has for his opponents, and the reaction that inspires among his opponents in the kind of extreme antagonism that it inspires in them towards Trump and towards those who would vote for him. What would that do to us as a nation, and would we be able to recover from it regardless of what happens in the election in November. So that's the question I would pose. And I guess, since I'm supposed to be making an argument in the negative, I would say, I'm not sure we would recover from it. And I really, really worry about the kind of insidious antagonism that might foment within the American civil discourse.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. We will now take questions, and I am going to go to Mike Gibbs.
Thank you, Chair and Ms. Speaker. I have a question. This is the first time I've done this. I'm a relatively new Red co-chair of a new alliance out in California. And so I just joined about 30 minutes ago. This question may have already been answered, but my question for the Speaker is, the Speaker made a passionate plea. Would the Speaker disqualify if the Speaker was Secretary of State of, pick any state, California, Maine, Colorado, would the Speaker disqualify Donald Trump from the ballot? Second question is, does the Speaker think that the people should, in fact, actually be the deciders and not some unelected official someplace? And third, does the Speaker think that this is a dangerous path? Because I thought this debate was about disqualification, not about whether or not we like Donald Trump or not. I'm a little bit disappointed in that a lot of the vitriol against Mr. Trump, who I voted for. But my last question is, if we are...
Let's not keep it to just a short number of questions, if you
Yes,
could.
okay, I'll make this my last, and I'll make it quick. If Mr. Trump is disqualified, what would prohibit any other candidate from arbitrarily being considered for disqualification? Mr. Biden, for example, for accepting money from foreign sources or lying about taking money as part of his son's business. I would ask the Speaker, what would disqualify, or what would keep any other candidate from being disqualified for any reason? And I would suggest that maybe every candidate here on out will be disqualified, and that's a concern to me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for those are really good questions, and welcome. To the first question, would I, if I were a state Supreme Court justice, disqualify him? I think, and I guess I'm going to tie this into your other question, your last question about sort of what's to stop this from happening to future, what's to stop us from going down a path of disqualifying candidates for whatever reason anybody can sort of pull out of their hat to disqualify somebody they don't like. I would say, and this has come up earlier in the debate, it's very dangerous. I agree. It's very worrying, especially to have, random officials in different states making this decision. I think the Supreme Court of the United States is supposed to be the body that we look to make this sort of decision when it is crucial to distinguish between sort of what might be popular in the moment and what is necessary for the preservation of our Constitution and of our republic. And so I would say, were I a Supreme Court justice, I might very well take Trump off the ballot. Were I sort of a state official, I would have maybe a different position, but hard to say, not being in that position. And then to your second question, I'm going to count that as my answer to your first and third, so just leave the second, which was, what was your second question? Aren't we considering, right, should a small minority, should unelected officials be allowed to decide rather than the people? I think it's a good question. And again, I'm really worried about it. And I would say my position was not intended even really to be an attack on Donald Trump himself or as a potential president, but just to say, it seems to me that we're in a moment when there's a real danger to our republic that's posed by the antagonism that Trump's presence in political life causes. And that if you are an official who has been appointed with the duty of protecting the Constitution, that you might have a responsibility to say, even though it's going to make some people upset, even though maybe it's a bad precedence in some ways, you have to make a decision to try and preserve the Constitution. So that's what I would say to that.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And we will take, let's see, Carolyn. Carolyn, your question for the Speaker.
Madam Chair, I would like to ask the Speaker, does she really believe that the lack of our civil, and I use that word loosely, discourse has been materially impacted by Trump, or were we already on that path prior to him?
That's a great question. Thank you. I think in many ways we were already on the path, right? I think you can go back way before Donald Trump to look for sort of increased vitriol and sort of doomsday rhetoric within our political discourse. Also, I mean, if you look at a longer time scale, there's lots of ups and downs in American public discourse. I think my sense, I would say from what I've seen and observed and experienced among my peers, my family members, it feels unique in my lived experience of the American public discourse, which is admittedly relatively short. And I think especially the attacks on trust in our institutions feels really unique. And although not entirely unique, but more dramatic in Donald Trump. So I would say, yes, that is my perspective. Whether it's true or not, I'm not sure I know, but that is how it seems to me.
And with that, our Speaker is thanked, especially for tackling a 4-part question. So well done there. And we will be wrapping up the formal debate part of the night and then moving on to our ritual to close out, which I hope you'll stick around for. We will be closing up the debate in about just under 10 minutes. So we are now looking for a speech in the affirmative, and I am wondering if Clark Ellis is still on deck out there. Clark, are you ready to speak?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I believe that this is primarily a legal question that was being posed by Braver Angels tonight. And I think if you look at Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, it's true that in it doesn't provide any criminal penalties or so forth. But I think you have to look at Section 5 of Article 14, which says that Congress can enforce it. And you have to look at the Insurrection Act of 1862, which indeed did that. So you have that circumstance. And then with the Section 5 and the section of the Insurrection Act together, and you have the prima facie evidence of anyone who had taken an oath to the Confederacy or served in the Confederate Armed Forces as being prima facie in rebellion against the United States. That's the background I think you have to look at. The current situation is very different. And I think that since Donald Trump has not even been indicted, let alone convicted of insurrection or giving benefit to the enemies of the United States, it's very hard to say that he should be taken off the ballot. If states can do that on their own with no due process, with no conviction of crimes, I think you're just making it available to mass media or political opponents to say anyone can be taken off the ballot. I think that would be a very dangerous thing to do. I ask those who have been in the negative on this to say, how in the world can they prevent abuses by just political pressures or media convicting someone of insurrection with no criminal even indictment or conviction or due process? Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We will now take a couple questions. I see Ronald, your hand has been raised for a while. Go for it.
I'd ask the Speaker, why does the speaker believe that the court is not involved in due process? We're not talking about a trial. We're talking about evaluating qualifications. And isn't that the same thing that the Supreme Court would be doing? Not a trial, but evaluating qualifications. And I ask, in light of that, on a slightly, is this actually just any person? The speaker made the comment that anyone could be removed. This is not just any person. The list is infinite of transgressions on his part. This is not just an ordinary person. There are circumstances, are there not, which are valid. This thing actually happened. People were killed. They were threatened with murder. There was a gallows hanging in front of the Capitol of the United States. How is this just any person?
May I respond, Madam Chairman, to the
Yes,
speaker?
please.
First of all, the only person killed in the riot at the Capitol was one of the supporters of Trump. No one else was killed. Secondly, the Supreme Court here is looking at the applicability of a constitutional question. It is not a trial.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We'll go to one other question. Let's go to Anne.
Okay, my question to the speaker has to do with the fact that, and so many other speakers have also addressed this, the idea that he has not been found guilty of insurrection. Much of this has to do with timing. At this point, it seems to me that there is, we are about to embark on a trial with the special counsel, Jack Smith, and it just hasn't taken place yet. Now, let's say that had already taken place and happened last year, 2023. It got all wrapped up. Obviously, it didn't. We're in the middle of many trials right now, unfortunately, which it had been done. Let's say that he had been found guilty of insurrection in this trial. Would that change your point of view about whether or not he should be allowed to be on the ballot?
Mr. Speaker?
Yes, if the former president had been convicted of insurrection and had exhausted all of his appeals and had been upheld, then certainly it would apply. But he has not been convicted. He's not even been indicted on the charges that are listed in the 14th Amendment, or the conditions, I won't say charge, the conditions in the 14th Amendment. So it is completely, in my view, not applicable.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And now we will go to our final speaker of the night. If Molly Zeff is ready to give her speech. Molly?
Sure. Oh, I feel I feel very unqualified to be the last speaker, but good to know. I think there's a reason some of us were hesitant to speak, and I just want to put it out there, which is that I'm not a lawyer and most of us aren't lawyers. I frankly have thoroughly enjoyed hearing from lawyers tonight. I've also enjoyed hearing from other people too, and I know it feels very risky. And with that, I'll say the argument that I am leaning towards, and I'll actually put out there that I'm purple on this. I actually don't fall strongly in one camp, but I'm going to put out my negative argument. And I'm just going to say it's partly like Luke here, like a former speaker. I don't know how to call former speakers. It's partly ideological. So, and partly logistical, actually. So in the history of the US, as far as I know, and I hope anybody will correct me if this is not true, we've never had a president who has a presidential candidate or a president who has been both accused of inciting an insurrection and also with this many pending legal issues. So I'll put out there, it turns out there are 91 criminal charges Trump is facing across 4 different, what do you call them, indictments? See, definitely not a lawyer here. I'm a business owner. And basically, with so many pending legal issues, I have very strong concerns based on precedent and also based on just logic that I can get to if I have time, that this number of legal issues will detract from the court system's ability to go through with those cases and will detract from all three branches' ability to run effectively should he be elected. And what I mean by that is I think that because we're dealing with so many unprecedented problems, should he be elected, we've never had someone with this many pending legal issues before also running the country. And my concern is it will actually detract from our ability to run the country well. That is hard during the best of times. And I think this is going to be one of the worst of times. And just to review, if you haven't brushed up on this recently, and just really quickly, New York, Trump faces 34 felony accounts. That's over falsifying business records to conceal money payments to a porn star. 40 felony accounts in Florida for allegedly hoarding classified documents and obstructing government's efforts to retrieve them. 4 counts in Washington for alleged efforts to overturn the 2020 election. More recently, he's been charged with 13 felony counts in his alleged attempts to overturn the 2020 election results in Georgia. In Georgia, the votes had already been counted 3 times, and yet he was still challenging those. So he doesn't even trust the very system that he wants to elect him. I also have an interesting
Molly, 15 seconds.
Oh, okay. So I'm just concerned about 91 legal issues with the president going into office. That sounds like a lot of legal issues. We could have 0 or maybe a few, but 91's a lot. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We will just take one question to wrap up, and I see Dan O'Sullivan.
Hello, I'm Dan O'Sullivan. Ms. Speaker, I have one question. Do you think that the question of this debate is a moot point? Because whether Trump,
apologies, does the speaker think?
Oh, what does the speaker? Sorry, what does the speaker think? Is it a moot point if Trump is on the ballot or not? Because I believe Kamala Harris gets to pick the next president. Is that not correct? Per Trump's statement, Kamala Harris gets to pick the president. It doesn't matter who's on the ballot. Thank you.
Okay, I don't think it's a moot point because the Electoral College usually picks a president. In fact, the popular vote doesn't even pick the president. We know that much. So I don't think it's Kamala Harris. I think that's more of a rubber stamp after the Electoral College picks the president.
And with that, our final speaker is thanked. And us now thanking all of you who spoke, who asked questions, and to those of you who didn't get a chance to speak, I apologize, and I hope that you will come back and give it another try. We just had a lot of people wanting to participate. So thank you, everybody. I am now going to ask for a motion to adjourn. Do I have an appropriate motion?
Madam Chairman, I move that this meeting be closed.
Do I have a second?
Second.
And with that, this debate is hereby adjourned.